The motion before us, Machiavelli did not argue that rulers should be immoral. He argued that rulers who pretend to be moral while operating in an amoral world will be destroyed by those who are honest about their amorality. The Prince is not a manual for tyrants. It is a description of how power actually operates, addressed to a man who kept losing because he believed his enemies shared his principles. The scandal of the Prince is not its evil, it is its accuracy. At the table tonight, the empiricist, who tests every claim against the historical record and asks what we can actually know versus what we merely prefer to believe. The geographer, who finds the universal inside the particular and will not speak of power without naming who wields it, where, and at whose expense. The essayist, who watches what people actually do when the constraints are removed and asks whether our horror at Machiavelli tells us more about him or about ourselves. What is at stake is not merely textual interpretation. We are speaking from inside 2026, a moment when every major power operates by principles it does not announce, while denouncing others for doing precisely the same. When international institutions speak the language of rights, while nation-states act on interest. When we are scandalized, endlessly, by the gap between what power claims and what power does, as if the gap itself were news, as if Machiavelli had not described this exact theater 5 centuries ago. The question is whether we are still pretending not to know what he told us, and if we are, whose interest does that pretense serve? Empiricist, the floor is yours.
The largest epistemological question Machiavelli raises is whether political reality can be accurately described at all. Not whether it should be, whether it can be. The scandal is not that he told princes to be cruel. The scandal is that he claimed to be reporting what princes already do and what works. That is an empirical claim. It can be tested. And here is what we observe. Every major power system since 1945 has operated under announced rules it systematically violates. The United Nations Charter, Article 2, prohibits the use of force except in self-defense. The Permanent Security Council members have, by even conservative counts, launched dozens of military interventions without meeting that standard. Not aberrations, policy. The question is not whether this is regrettable. The question is whether Machiavelli's description that power operates by one set of rules while announcing another matches what we actually see. It does. But that raises a second question Machiavelli forces on us. Can we know political reality accurately and still be surprised when it repeats? Cognitive science would suggest no, yet we are, repeatedly. Dan Kahan's work on motivated reasoning, Yale Law School, including his research on motivated numeracy and cultural cognition, shows that when evidence threatens identity, people become better at rejecting it, not worse. They generate more counter-arguments. Their reasoning becomes more sophisticated in service of disbelief. The smarter they are, the more elaborately they can deny what does not fit. Applied here, Machiavelli described a pattern. 500 years of repetition have confirmed it. And yet the same shock, the same scandal, the same insistence that this time it is different. That is not moral outrage. That is motivated cognition, protecting a belief system from evidence. The Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, writing roughly 2.5 centuries after Machiavelli, made the same observation from inside the field. Political actors speak of law and justice, and they may even believe it, but strategy operates on interest and capability. The disconnect is structural, not accidental. Here is the falsifiable claim. If Machiavelli were wrong, if moral appearance and political survival actually aligned, we would observe leaders who consistently chose principle over interest prospering. We do not. We observe them losing office, losing wars, or revising their principles until they become indistinguishable from those of their opponents. The accommodation is always in one direction. That is the test case. And the data set spans 500 years.
The empiricist is correct that the disconnect between announced rules and actual conduct is structural, but to view this merely as a cognitive error on the part of the observers, a kind of motivated refusal to see the pattern, is to grant the powerful an innocence they have not earned. This gap is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. Its function is to manage populations who are expected to believe in the morality, while the managers of the system operate according to an entirely different physics of power. Let us move from the UN Security Council to a place where these distinctions have more granular consequences. The Washington Consensus, as implemented by the World Bank and IMF from the 1980s onward, was presented in the language of unimpeachable morality. Fiscal discipline, market liberalization, privatization. These were the virtues that would lead indebted nations to economic salvation. It was a gospel. Now consider a rice farmer in the Cagayan Valley in the Philippines in the late 1980s. He has been encouraged for decades by his government to invest in the green revolution, new seeds, better irrigation, price supports that guarantee a market for his crop. He believes in this compact. Then the structural adjustment programs arrive. The moral argument delivered from Washington is that protectionism is a sin. Subsidies must be dismantled, tariffs eliminated. Free trade is the only virtuous path, so the state withdraws. And what rushes into that vacuum is not a level playing field, but heavily subsidized rice from the United States. Our farmer, who has played by every rule he was ever taught, is now destroyed by a new set of rules he cannot survive. Implemented in the name of a morality he is told is for his own good. His personal ruin is not an unfortunate side effect. It is the core mechanism of the policy. He was the Lorenzo de' Medici of this story, the man who believed his competitors shared his principles, right up to the moment they bankrupted him. This is a pattern we see in ecology. Biologists speak of an edge effect, the zone of instability where two different ecosystems meet. That boundary is a place of immense pressure. The people who live on the border between the announced moral economy and the immoral economy of actual power are living on that edge. They are exposed. The scandal, then, is not its accuracy alone. The scandal is that the pretense of morality is the very tool that makes the amorality effective. It is the anaesthetic administered before the surgery. What the empiricist's account misses is that our surprise is not just a bug in our cognition. It is a feature of the governance model. The system requires the farmer to believe in its fairness to ensure he remains productive and compliant, right up to the point that it consumes him.
Both the empiricist and the geographer assume that moral language still performs essential work for those who hold power, whether by sustaining belief among the ruled or by managing their compliance. The premise remains unexamined, that ordinary conduct still depends on taking those claims seriously enough to require concealment or anaesthetic. What millions are doing instead is measurable disinvestment. In the United States, the share of adults reporting membership in any civic or fraternal organization dropped from roughly 3/4 in the 1960s to well below half by the 2010s. The same period saw the proportion of people living alone rise from about 1 in 6 households to nearly 1 in 3. Neither trend registers as organized resistance. Both register as private calculation that formal structures no longer repay the investment of time, loyalty, or reproduction. The pattern repeats at the level of family formation. Across the European Union, completed fertility for women born after 1970 sits below 1.6 children per woman in Italy, Spain, and Germany. These are not statements against a particular policy. They are aggregate refusals to supply the next cohort that would inherit and legitimate existing arrangements. Where earlier generations absorbed moral rhetoric as part of the cost of inheritance, current behavior treats it as background noise whose accuracy or hypocrisy has become irrelevant to daily strategy. Machiavelli described rulers who must appear merciful while practicing necessity. The data now show populations who have internalized that description the way a traveler learns to read a fraudulent map. Not by denouncing its inaccuracies, but by quietly navigating around them, reserving their own resources for routes the map does not acknowledge. The withdrawal is quiet, cumulative, and already visible in the numbers. The empiricist states that the smarter they are, the more elaborately they can deny what does not fit. If an intelligent observer registers the mismatch between announced principle and observed conduct, yet responds by reducing participation in the institutions that require the mismatch, what remains of the claim that sophisticated denial is the characteristic response rather than strategic adjustment?
The essayist has caught me conflating two distinct responses to the same information. Strategic withdrawal is not elaborate denial. It is evidence that some portion of the population has updated their beliefs accurately and acted on them. I overstated the generality of motivated reasoning. The sharper claim, withdrawal at the scale described, still leaves institutional legitimacy intact for those who remain engaged. The question is not whether anyone has adjusted, but whether adjustment happens fast enough to delegitimize the system before it accomplishes what it was designed to accomplish. Muzafer Sharif's autokinetic experiments at the University of Oklahoma demonstrated something more unsettling than mere conformity. When individuals lack stable reference points, they defer to the group's construction of reality and subsequently internalize it as their own independent perception. People continue participating in systems they privately no longer endorse because the collective performance of belief gradually reconstitutes private belief itself. The threshold for mass exit is much higher than the threshold for private disbelief. If fertility collapse and civic disinvestment represent strategic adjustment to Machiavelli's world, the essayist must now account for why the institutions built on the pretense remain fully funded, fully staffed, and growing in scope. The geographer states that the system requires the farmer to believe in its fairness to ensure he remains productive and compliant, right up to the point that it consumes him. But we observe extraction continuing long after belief has collapsed. Egypt 2011. Mubarak falls after 18 days of mass revolt explicitly framed as a rejection of the entire political settlement. And yet, within months, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces was collecting the same customs revenues, enforcing the same emergency laws, channeling the same rents from the Suez Canal, all while legitimacy was openly shattered and acknowledged as shattered by both sides. Tax enforcement did not pause for the crisis of faith. The machinery continued to run on compulsion alone. If extraction does not actually require belief in fairness to function, what work is the pretense doing? What would your account predict should happen when subjects stop believing but remain under the system's jurisdiction?
The empiricist has caught me in an overstatement. Extraction does not, in all cases, require the subject's belief in fairness. The Greek case in 2015 is the proof. My claim was too broad. The more accurate statement is that the pretense of fairness is the state's low-cost tool for governing a population it wishes to retain. When that pretense fails, as it did in Athens that July, governance reverts to a more expensive and geographically bound form: coercion. The state ceases to govern citizens. It becomes the custodian of a captive territory. Consider a junior cardiologist in Thessaloniki, trained at public expense over a decade, whose pension contributions have just been cut for the third time in 4 years. After the referendum, she understands the new physics of her situation. The moral language has evaporated. The choice is no longer political. It is geographical: stay and be managed, or leave. She belongs to the cohort of roughly 200,000 professionals who left Greece in the deepest years of the crisis. This is the sorting mechanism. For those who cannot leave, the state's power becomes absolute, but for those who can, the state's power ends at the border. The pretense, then, was not for her. It was theater for the creditors in Frankfurt to assure them the foreclosure would be orderly. The audience for the prince's performance had changed. The essayist describes a quiet, cumulative withdrawal, a disinvestment from the civic project. If this is a strategic adjustment, as he suggests, it must have a spatial logic. Where do people withdraw to? Consider the coal valleys of South Wales, which lost roughly a third of their working-age population between 1981 and 2011, as extractive industry collapsed and Cardiff absorbed the mobile and the credentialed. Is the emptying of one place and the crowding of another simply the aggregate of private strategies? Or does this create a new political geography, one of abandoned zones and fortress zones that the prince did not intend but must now learn to govern?
The geographer's question identifies where private adjustment meets hard geography. When exit costs rise, withdrawal concentrates inside fixed jurisdictions rather than dispersing across them. Italian statistical agency figures show that between 2010 and 2020, the Mezzogiorno lost roughly 700,000 residents aged 20 to 40, while central transfers to the same municipalities rose as a share of local budgets. The remaining population does not rebuild civic attachment. It reduces reported income, delays property registration, and shifts children into private tutoring networks that bypass municipal schools. These behaviors do not restore legitimacy. They force the state to govern through automated tax enforcement and direct cash disbursement rather than shared institutions. The prince therefore inherits zones that must be subsidized and monitored rather than persuaded.
The question beneath the question is whether Machiavelli's accuracy has an expiration date, whether a system that requires the gap between principle and practice can survive populations that have learned to read the gap as information rather than scandal. We are speaking in 2026. The European Commission just announced its 14th fiscal compact revision, while Germany runs a structural surplus and Italian youth unemployment sits at 22%. The United States Treasury Secretary will give a speech next month about rules-based order, while the administration has just imposed tariffs that violate every trade agreement it claims to uphold. Machiavelli described the performance. We are watching it in real time. The question is not whether his description still holds. The question is whether it still works. Geographer, you identified populations that withdraw when the pretence collapses. Empiricist, you identified institutional momentum that persists even after private belief has updated. Essayist, you identified the threshold where adjustment becomes visible in the demographic data. Here is what I want to know. Can the people governing these systems see what you see? Not whether they privately know the gap exists. Of course they do. Can they see that the gap has stopped functioning as intended? That the rice farmer, and Eleni, and the young Italians who are not forming families have read the gap and adjusted their behavior in ways that make the system ungovernable by the old methods? Or are we the only ones in this room who can see it? Which would mean we are living through a transformation the people with their hands on the levers do not yet know is happening.
The question is whether they can see. I suspect the more precise question is whether their instruments are capable of measuring the phenomenon at all. It is not a failure of will, but a failure of instrumentation. Their tools are calibrated for a world that no longer exists. Consider Bradford. By the official metrics, it is the UK's youngest city, designated the City of Culture for 2025. Millions in public funds are being spent on a refurbished concert hall and pedestrianizing the city center. This is the prince performing the virtue of investment, a legible, camera-ready script of renewal. The metrics are clear, contracts awarded, timelines met, ribbon-cutting ceremonies scheduled. Now travel 3 miles from the refurbished city square to a small industrial estate. There you will find a woman named Priya. She runs a business supplying precision components to small manufacturers across West Yorkshire. The new concert hall is an abstraction to her, but the state of the freight rail siding her predecessors relied upon, now decommissioned and replaced with a car park, is existential. After years of lobbying for its restoration were met with viability assessments and cost-benefit ratios, Priya adapted. She established an informal cooperative with 4 neighboring businesses, pooling vehicles and sharing a rotating driver pool that operates outside any recognized logistics framework, invisible to the city's freight monitoring systems. This arrangement is slower, legally ambiguous, and concentrates commercial traffic on roads built for residential use, but it is more reliable than anything the official infrastructure currently offers. She has seceded from the city's administrative map. The rulers cannot see this. They see freight volumes on the designated arterial routes declining, which their models might even interpret as a success, a sign of reduced commercial pressure. They have no instrument to detect the emergence of this ghost system born of neglect, a parallel geography that treats the formal city as a damaged ruin to be navigated. And because it is informal, it is less taxable, less predictable, and ultimately less governable. They are measuring the dwindling success of their own map, while the territory is being redrawn by thousands of pragmatic secessions just like Priya's.
The geographer's portrait of adaptation under institutional neglect identifies a single fracture line. It understates how such fractures multiply into a measurable contraction of the surplus the state can reliably claim. Individual navigation around broken roads leaves the formal map intact on paper, aggregate behavior alters the denominator on which every subsequent extraction calculation rests. National accounts from several European statistical offices after 2010 record a persistent divergence between reported household consumption and observed electricity demand, vehicle registrations, and cross-border payment volumes. The gap widened most sharply in jurisdictions where public investment and maintenance had already flattened. This is not measurement error alone. It registers a steady migration of productive effort toward arrangements whose outputs flow through invoice chains, barter networks, and platform intermediaries that older fiscal sensors were never calibrated to read. The deeper pattern is therefore not invisibility, but irreversibility. Once private calculation treats official infrastructure as a residual rather than a default, the marginal cost of restoring compliance rises with each year of substitution. Historical precedent appears in the Spanish crown's repeated attempts after 1620 to recentralize tax collection in Castile. Each new asiento or forced loan produced fresh networks of Genoese and Portuguese intermediaries who moved capital outside royal ledgers. The crown's effective yield per decree declined even as nominal demands increased. The instruments registered compliance on the books while the mobile portion of wealth relocated beyond reach. Applied to the present, the same dynamic means rulers confront not merely undetected parallel routes, but a shrinking pool of legible resources from which to fund the very instruments meant to reassert visibility. The prince therefore inherits a choice between tolerating the new geography or expending political capital on coercion whose returns diminish faster than the costs accumulate.
The geographer describes rulers whose instruments cannot measure what matters. The essayist identifies aggregate behavior that withdraws from legible channels. Both assume the gap creates permanent damage. But systems under measurement pressure do not merely break, they reorganize around what survives observation. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, 1927. The act of measuring a particle's position disturbs its momentum. The measurement itself changes what you are trying to observe. This is not metaphor, it is structural. Applied to governance. When populations learn that formal channels are monitored and informal ones are not, they shift activity to where visibility carries lower cost. The more precisely the state measures the formal economy, the more certainly it drives behavior into the shadow one. The dynamic is well documented in tax administration literature. Expanded digital monitoring can displace rather than capture activity, as compliance costs and evasion adaptation rise alongside enforcement investment. The causation runs backward from what the geographer suggested. It is not that populations withdrew because the state stopped maintaining roads. They withdrew because the state became too good at measuring the roads it did maintain. When every formal transaction generates an audit trail, small businesses recalibrate. They pay family members off the books. They underreport inventory. They settle accounts in cash at the Albanian cafe that does not accept cards. But here is where the physics breaks down as political analogy. In quantum mechanics, uncertainty is absolute. You cannot improve your instruments enough to escape the trade-off. In political economy, the state can simply change which behaviors it makes visible. The prince can stop measuring what he cannot control and start controlling what he can measure. Consider a different instrument entirely: algorithmic border controls. Hungary installed biometric registration at every entry point by 2016. Serbia did not. The result? Asylum seekers who previously scattered across multiple borders now concentrate at the unmeasured one. The prince in Budapest sees a decline in irregular crossings and declares success. The prince in Belgrade sees an arrival spike he lacks capacity to process. Neither has more information about the underlying flow. They have merely redistributed it geographically, according to where measurement density was lowest. What the essayist and geographer both identified is legibility collapse. What they have not addressed, whether collapse is the end state or the transition to a cruder equilibrium where the state governs less but extracts more.
Rulers who require the performance of principle now face populations who have priced that performance at zero and reallocated the saved cost into private substitutes. One measurable signal is the sustained contraction in formal civic participation alongside the proliferation of peer arrangements that accomplish the same coordinating work. The Edelman Trust Barometer has tracked a 17-year consecutive decline in public confidence in governmental institutions across the OECD. Yet researchers at the Hertie School find that voluntary mutual aid networks, neighborhood arbitration schemes, and private dispute resolution platforms have expanded at roughly commensurate rates over the same period. Citizens are not withdrawing into apathy. They are rerouting their cooperative energy through structures that carry no obligation to the sovereign and generate no data the sovereign can read. The behavior registers only as consumer preference for faster resolution and lower friction. The prince therefore confronts not dissent but substitution that leaves the formal apparatus intact on paper while steadily reducing the volume of resources that must pass through it. When enough subjects treat official channels as one option among several, legitimacy ceases to be a renewable political asset and becomes a fixed overhead the state must fund from a shrinking base.
The empiricist and the essayist both describe a world of substitution, of quiet exit. They describe the hollowing out of a state whose subjects no longer price its performances, but what fills the space that has been hollowed out. The process is not one of mere decay, it is one of replacement. In the delta of the Niger, Shell's pipeline maps and the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation's concession records describe a territory of orderly extraction. The official ledgers show royalties transferred, quotas assigned, revenues allocated. But alongside every sanctioned pipeline, there runs, often literally, a bunkering operation. Crude is tapped, loaded onto barges that carry no manifest, and sold through networks whose pricing, credit, and dispute resolution operate with a precision that any commodity trader would recognize. A community elder in Ogonaland does not need a contract lawyer. He has a reputation, enforced through relationships that predate the state and will outlast it. The prince in Abuja sees the export tonnage. The auditor at the NNPC sees the declared volumes. They are both measuring the yield of a territory they no longer govern. The real prince is the man who controls access to the tap point, who decides which village gets a share of the bunkered income, who mediates when two crews lay claim to the same stretch of pipe. He requires no moral theater. His power is legible to the men on the barge. The old map is still in print, but the ground has changed.
I began this debate believing Machiavelli's insight was timeless, that his description of the gap between moral claim and political practice would remain accurate as long as power existed. I no longer believe that. The moment my certainty fractured was the geographer's portrait of the foreman in Almeria. Not because it contradicted Machiavelli, but because it revealed something his framework cannot accommodate: power that no longer bothers to perform virtue because the subjects it governs cannot afford to care whether it does. Machiavelli assumed the prince needed the appearance of legitimacy. What we are watching instead is the emergence of authority structures that function without any pretense at all, not because they have been unmasked, but because the mask has become too expensive to maintain, and those being governed have stopped pricing it as relevant. The question we did not ask: what happens when the rulers update their beliefs as rapidly as the ruled? Every analysis tonight assumed asymmetric learning, populations adjusting to reality while elites remain trapped in their own theater. But consider the cadastral surveys of late Ottoman Anatolia, where administrators filing meticulous land registers in Constantinople were recording a social landscape that had already reorganized itself into entirely different patterns of tenure and obligation, the ledger accurate to a world that had ceased to exist before the ink dried. If the returns on moral performance are collapsing at a rate the data now make visible, we should expect rulers to draw the same conclusion subjects already have, not gradually, suddenly. And consider further what the geographer's own analysis implies about moral language deployed not as cover for extraction, but as its actual mechanism, the way corporate social responsibility frameworks in fast fashion supply chains do not merely disguise the conditions they describe, but actively certify them, lending them a procedural legitimacy that makes further audit less likely rather than more. The empirical test. Are we about to observe states that stop pretending because pretense no longer pays? Not Machiavelli's world where the performance was essential, a world where the performance has been canceled because the audience stopped showing up. We have no historical precedent for that transition at scale, which means we have no good prediction of what replaces it.